SDG 360 Thinking, From Classroom to Community. This lecture presents 5 ways that university community partnerships can advance the Sustainable Development Goals. It has been prepared at the invitation of the EPIC Network, which works with universities and local governments around the world to advance the Sustainable Development Goals through high road strategies and to help communities realize their own visions for sustainable, equitable, and prosperous futures. This lecture is presented by Lori DiPrete Brown, a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and co-chair of the UniverCity Alliance.
Welcome to SDG Thinking, From Classroom to Community. My name is Lori DiPrete Brown, and I teach in Civil Society and Community Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm also a co-chair of the UniverCity Alliance, which hosts UW's UniverCity Year program. We use the EPIC model to work with cities and communities of all sizes throughout Wisconsin. Today, I'm going to be sharing an approach to the work that I call SDG 360 Thinking. SDG 360 Thinking uses the Sustainable Development Goals to create clarity and consensus, to foster inclusion, and to address the complex challenges that local governments face with a holistic lens. I'll be presenting 5 ways that you and your students can advance the UN Sustainable Development Goals in your collaborations with local government. Whether you're teaching about the SDGs and wanting to do more in the community, or conversely, you're working in the community and wanting to have a more explicit focus on the SDGs, I hope you'll find one or more of these approaches useful and feasible to integrate into your classes and your community engaged work. Thank you. I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement and recommend that you do this as well as you approach this work that has so much to do with land and community and history and the future. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejope since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. It's important to consider the legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that have brought us together here today, and to join in uncovering such truths and addressing them justly every day. I think this is important in all of our work. It's especially important when we do community engaged work to remember this and carry this forward into the work, not just at the beginning, but to return to it with our students. So SDG thinking is really just what it says, thinking, analytically, procedurally, processually with the SDGs, using it as a framework. And of course, in order to do that, a clear understanding of what the SDGs are and what they come from is needed. And this should not be assumed or taken for granted. In many, or I would say most, cities and local governments and communities around the country, there is not a lot of awareness about what the Sustainable Development Goals are. So in brief, they are a series of 17 goals with 169 targets and a number of related indicators that really help us to define what it means to have, a thriving world, a world that is doing well and caring for the environment as well as people for the present and in the future. And if you look here, there's 2 graphic representations of the 17 SDGs. One are these sort of boxes, and the other is this wheel. And I think all of these graphics are kind of a common and familiar language as well. And so the 17 SDGs deal with things like poverty, hunger, health, education, gender equity, clean water, things that really get at basic needs. Other SDGs relate to things that have to do with the environment, like climate change, life below water, life on land. And then some others deal with our social world, economic development, um, affordable energy, jobs, infrastructure, um, peace and justice in our institutions, and so on. So you can really take a deep dive into these 17 SDGs with the students. And I have some resources to do that here. Information about the SDGs, um, detailed lists of the data and indicators that you can look up, where you can get profiles at the level of countries, at the level of states, at the level of cities often. And there are also logos and graphics that use this, system of colors and icons. And it's a nice way for students to bring their work into, continuity and alignment with the SDG movement to use those logos and graphics. So that's why I have that link there. And I guess in terms of the 360 thinking part of this, once you kind of know what the SDGs are, there's two ways to use them to think with. One way is to think of them as boxes or tags or buckets that you can put things in, or a checklist, if you will, that can help you to think about what you should be thinking about. And that's kind of the graphic on the left helps you to do that. But another way of using, and that's useful. So tagging and all those very simple things are very powerful and useful because they create common language and clarity of purpose and so forth. But when you're doing work with complex problems, then you might want to think more about using the SDGs as a wheel, using them in an integrated way, and putting your work at the center of that wheel, and then really thinking about how it might relate to a critical cluster of SDGs, or all the SDGs, or a selection of targets. And when we go through the 5 ways, we'll talk about some strategies to use the SDGs both as tags and wheels. But step 1 is get to know the SDGs, talk about them, and have it become, a comfortable language that students can use and then apply in their work with communities. So what are the 5 ways that you can do SDG 360 thinking with your students and communities? The first one is to explain the SDGs with local examples. This way, you begin by showing that the SDGs are relevant and the topics they address are urgent and worthy of communities' attention. The second way is to cross the SDGs with city plans. This allows you to make connections with the SDGs and what's already happening, to affirm the positive elements there, and to highlight things that could be added. The third thing is to assist with voluntary local reporting. As I'll explain later, there is a national movement toward doing this kind of local reporting, and it enhances local monitoring and accountability and transparency about how we're really doing in relation to the SDGs. The fourth thing is to conduct SDG 360 analysis, and this is sort of an implementation science kind of approach that helps us to integrate work across different sectors. It helps us to optimize our actions and identify both co-benefits and trade-offs that are implicit in our plans and our actions. And this allows us then to make intentional choices. And I think it enhances, takes some steps toward the 5th way, which is maybe should be the first. And I think it's the most important, and it's cross-cutting, and this is cross-cutting. And this is where we center equity and inclusion. And I will talk about the ways that the SDGs can help us do that, but also some other tools that can help you do that in your work. Before we dig into the 5 ways that you can work with students to make change and to apply the Sustainable Development Goals in a meaningful way, we really do need to look at sustainability and how we're talking about sustainability with students and communities. It is a multidimensional and contested topic. We all know what we mean. individually, but we don't always have the same collective understanding of sustainability. So I'm going to walk you through briefly some resources and images that I've chosen and that I think are the best ones for the uses that we have in working with local government. And I'm hoping that this will complement things you already use, or that perhaps you'll be able to just develop a session or a lecture with these readings and concepts. So what does sustainable development really mean? When did this conversation start, and where will it end? One important moment, which I think we can say for the purposes of a basic course, is where the conversation started, or the big conversation started at least, is in 1987 in the UN World Commission on Environment and Development report called Our Common Future. Sustainable development was defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And Gro Brundtland is often cited as the person to have said this. She actually part of a joint report that she authored with a bunch of international scholars from Sudan, Italy, Saudi Arabia, and in Zimbabwe. So it was a very global and north-south movement right from the beginning. And I would say when I look at this definition now, for those of us who were around at the time and already working in development, which I am one of those people, it's very satisfying. It was a big idea for us to think about now and the future. But as I look at it now, it's almost not enough. We say we don't want to compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And I think not compromising their ability is such a low bar for what we want to do for the future. We want to anticipate and make the road smoother and so forth. And so in some ways, the bar has been raised on what we need to do for future generations since 1987. And there's also been some really helpful specificity attached to the notion of sustainability that is worth getting into in your conversations with students and with communities. So here we have 3 different ways of graphically mapping sustainability, and I'm going to talk about the 3 pillars of sustainability. Sometimes when you're working in communities, when you talk about sustainability, there will be an assumption that you're referring to environmental activism or preservation, and there can even be comments raised like, what about the economy, or what about equity? And I think it's not always known, at the community level, that actually sustainability itself has 3 pillars, which include environmental, economic, and social considerations. And so, in a sense, sustainability already is that space of compromise and mutual benefits and optimization. And so, the one definition talks about sustainability having come to be understood as a multi-dimensional concept with interactions and intersections among 3 pillars that really shape the human experience: the environment, social equity, and economics. And so I think that is an important thing to consider. When you look at the images on the right, one looks like kind of a Greek temple, and it has three pillars: social, environmental, and economic. And people have then moved that into more of a Venn diagram that shows the overlapping. And then a third image is concentric circles where the economy is totally embedded, because without a solid environment and care for the environment, we can't really have the foundation for social equity or the economy. So there's a lot of ways that you can think about this image, but the key thing is that these 3 things work together in a fully realized concept of sustainability. Here we have another graphic image of the 3 pillars of sustainability that I think is useful for the kind of work you're doing, because it allows you to place specific disciplinary work or work that you might do with communities onto the map of sustainability. So there are 3 overlapping circles of equal size. Environmental issues are one circle, social equity issues are another, and economic are another. And in each circle, there are some things that, fit there. So for economic, you're talking about profit and growth and economic development. In social, you'd be thinking about the standard of living, quality of life, education, and so forth. And in the environmental, you get into more care, pollution prevention, biodiversity, natural resource management. The graphic also makes the point that some things happen, especially at these different intersections. So environment and economic intersect around things like energy efficiency or renewable fuel or green technology. Economics and social intersect around things like business ethics, fair trade, workers' rights. And then the social and environmental intersect around environmental justice and global stewardship. You could argue also mental health and well-being and socio-emotional health. And then in the middle, there's this sort of sweet spot, a little triangle in the middle, where all three interact. And that's where the fully realized sustainability can happen, when you've taken into account social equity, environmental factors, and economic, and you've really thought about optimizing in that light. And so that is the position here, as the SDGs can be a tool to help you to do that. Another conversation about the SDGs is to really take issue with the idea that there are those three equal circles interacting. And this instead looks at the environmental elements, the biosphere itself, the land and the water, as foundational. That's the floor upon which society is built. And then society is the foundation upon which the economy is built. So here you have some hierarchy of values that it's important to think about and discuss with students. And sometimes the conversations in the community might not be thinking about it this way, and some of your students might feel the economy is the most important, and what really is the foundation of what. These are good learning conversations to have. But I think this idea that the environment and natural resources, the things we can't place, are the foundation, is an important way of thinking about sustainability. Now here's another definition that I think is really important and useful. It is the one that I think helps me to operationalize this work the most. And it's from John Morelli in 2001. And he is aiming to define environmental sustainability for environmental professionals. And so this is you and your students and really all of us, right? This does not mean just urban planners, but public health and local government officials can all fit into this group of people, professionals, who are working on sustainability and need a working definition. And so here we talk about sustainability as meeting the resource and service needs of current and future generation. That captures that first definition beautifully, without compromising the health of the ecosystems that provide these, and more specifically, as a condition of balance, resilience, and interconnectedness. So we begin to have some big ideas that we can use to work in this space. All of this allows human society to satisfy its needs while neither exceeding the capacity of the supporting ecosystems to continue to regenerate the services necessary to meet the needs. So it's one thing not to spend everything, but to leave regenerative capacity in place is a really big idea that's very important. And so not only do we want to create or leave in place regenerative capacity, but we also do not want to diminish biological diversity. So I think this gives you a very useful working rubric and big ideas to think about, to develop mindsets and skills and ways of looking at problems. It goes sort of beyond technical tools when you start thinking about balance and resilience and interconnectedness and what that can mean, and how to value regenerative capacity and biological diversity. So I think a deep dive into what sustainability is going to be time well spent with your students as sort of laying the groundwork to have the conceptual foundation that they need to talk about the SDGs, to apply them, to critique them when necessary, and to have the agility to be very practical in making change with this framework. And I think it's good to also, wrap up this conversation about sustainability with making sure students are aware that it really is a local and global movement. People around the world are using the SDGs to realize their hopes for sustainable cities and communities. This is a movement in the United States as well, at the city and neighborhood level. It's really just beginning, and it's a great time to learn about this and to be able to bring this knowledge and skills into whatever career they might be, or whatever jobs they might be going into after graduation. This is a great video that I use as a resource that's kind of motivating and has more of that movement feel. So you have the professional feel and you have the academic, and now you have kind of a movement vibe to get everybody on the same page about all the things that sustainability should be, and people should be able to explain it to their families and friends and communities, and in the community engagement work that you're embarking on. So now let's talk about the 5 ways that you can use SDG 360 thinking to work with communities. The first way that you can use SDG 360 thinking with your students in their partnerships with local government is to explain the SDGs with local examples. This will help to establish the relevance of the SDGs, and perhaps also the degree to which they're aligned with local priorities, they're relevant for people's own lives, and that there's some urgency to take some action to advance the SDGs. I think this conversation can ideally be framed as a nonpartisan one. A lot of times when we hear people talking about the SDGs, there can be sort of an unnecessary assumption about partisan identities. And in fact, I think that these are goals that people can come together across party lines, or even bring people who are not politically active into becoming more politically active. So the SDGs can contribute to civic health in that way. This overall approach will increase the public understanding of this triple bottom line of sustainability, what we sometimes call the 3 E's: equity, economics, and environment. And so all of these things can be experienced as interconnected when you have these local examples. Students might organize storytelling activities, such as on social media or through events about the SDGs. They can focus on one, or they can focus on all of them. They might work with schools or in community settings, or in partnership with local organizations. And when they link the SDGs to local places, issues, and histories, this really creates some momentum for some of the other strategies for SDG 360 action that we'll be talking about. I think it's also important to encourage students to use both science-based information and metrics, as well as narrative and arts-based approaches in this storytelling or local examples of the SDGs. Here is a nice example of explaining the SDGs with local examples. It's from a student project at Occidental College, where they have a program, an ongoing program using the SDGs in local work. And it's called Just Transition in Los Angeles, Ensuring Equity During Decarbonization. And this student has analyzed the situation and highlighted the ways in which it's relevant in terms of SDGs 8, 11, and 13. And you can just see that we begin to see how the SDGs are, about our own community. And that's a great way to begin to establish relevance and urgency, as we talked about. Here's another example of communicating a complex problem with the SDGs. This focuses on understanding student housing instability and looking at how it relates to poverty, education, inequality, and some issues related to sustainable cities. So you see those 4 SDG icons tagged here. It's another example of just a one-page poster or social media post that can really effectively show that the SDGs really matter for local issues and issues at the community level. I hope that these examples help you to envision how you might explain the SDGs with local stories. A few suggestions of how you might proceed include perhaps starting with school-based education projects that tell local stories about the SDGs, or social media campaigns that focus on local places or natural spaces or local histories. You can also think about choosing topics that relate to contemporary city plans and priorities. And again, I'll reiterate, I think it's helpful to avoid partisan framing and try to create spaces where people are coming together around shared purpose. I don't think it is always necessary to reference the UN or climate action specifically at the outset, because these goals include all of that, but in a way there's much more to it. And I think that you can introduce these aspects after the local relevance and urgency is established and after the SDGs are explained in the context of local priorities and lived experience. So a second way to use SDG 360 thinking in your work with cities is to crosswalk the SDGs with city plans or the city planning process. This is a very useful way to foster human well-being, economic prosperity, environmental restoration, and sustainability. And it allows you to begin really with a positive approach of identifying affinities and places where the local government is already doing some work. So if they're beginning a planning process, you can certainly use the SDGs as a guide, but very often plans will already be in place. And so this crosswalk activity can be carried out. And this means that you look for affinities, you look to identify areas where the city is already working well, as well as gaps or areas that could easily be addressed, and then things also that would be more challenging. A really important aspect of this crosswalk activity is to make sure that it is visually really simple and appealing by using the SDG tagging and graphics and integrating that with whatever kind of branding or visualizations have been used in the city. You can really, create that sense of synergy. So I think the SDG framework and the targets, they give a structure and clarity to a complex process, and this can help the cities to see ways that things are interrelated, ways that they're organized, and ways that they can communicate more clearly. Often cities are not that not that interested in tools that are going to help them get into the details more. They already have experts. They know their own details. But when you talk about a framework that is going to help them to see interconnections or work across sectors, that is usually pretty appealing because people find that to be a challenge. This kind of SDG 360 thinking, this approach, also facilitates clear implementation. It facilitates sharing and comparison across settings, and it facilitates scale-up of successful innovations. So students can do a preliminary crosswalk or analysis of local city plans and prepare a report and visual graphics for city leaders, and I'll show you some examples of that. They can also go deeper and provide cities with relevant local data related to their plans within an SDG framework. And they can also support activities that engage residents in planning and understanding the complex plans that might be happening around them within an SDG 360 framework. So here's an example of an effort to do this in Pittsburgh that was done at Penn State University. It's called Taking a Deeper Look into Pittsburgh. The short article explores how goal one, this one is about poverty, and they have it highlighted here. And the article talks about poverty in Pittsburgh, and a series talking about each of the SDGs was planned. So that's an example where, what's happening in Pittsburgh, what could happen. Let's see where the conversation is and move it forward. Here's an example from San Jose, where you can again see the localization and just a visual representation that San Jose is on board with doing these things together for more well-being in the community and healthy environment and economy. So that's another example. The state of Hawaii has done a lot with using the SDGs as a planning tool, and here's an example of how they have visually represented it, looking at the State Planning Act, the Hawaii 2050 plan, and the Aloha Plus Challenge. And you see they've used the SDGs and the related icons, and then highlighting elements from each of the plans. So, when you look at this kind of crosswalk or matrix analysis, you get the sense that, the state of Hawaii is really working on the SDGs and going forward. And that creates a foundation to do more and to fill gaps and to create momentum in a positive way. Now, you might be wondering what to do if there's already a plan in place and you want to be doing this SDG crosswalking. Did you miss your opportunity? Well, the experience in New York City says no. Several months after the One NYC plan was launched, the world leaders gathered in New York to commit to the SDGs. So their plan had just been completed. And what they did was they looked at the alignment after the fact and did the same kind of crosswalk analysis that I'm talking about. So here, the One NYC plan talked about vibrant democracy. You hear SDG 16 echoing there. Inclusive economy, that would be 8. Thriving neighborhoods, that would be 11. Healthy lives, that would be 3. And so on. Livable climate, 13. Education, there's 4. And so it was there, but not there. And that is often the case, that many cities around the U.S. are not explicitly talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, despite the fact that it is such an important global movement. And moving that needle so that it is the common conversation is really an important part of why we might do the work that we're talking about. But I'm eager to show you what New York City did in terms of their crosswalk. Here you see how things were brought together with the One NYC visions and the SDGs, and they chose to take the visions and then show graphically how the SDGs related to them. And that opens the door for people who are trying to implement or motivate or catalyze to use the goals and targets that might be sub-targets here, and to link all those things about metrics into this, and to just be part of the conversation and lead. New York City did some other important leadership that I'll talk about next, related to voluntary local reporting. But this is just another example about how you might make the relationship between your own city plans and the SDGs visual. In fact, I did just that exercise here in Madison, Wisconsin, with some of my students in a fall civil society leadership class. We worked with City of Madison advisor Kara Fradowitz, who is a performance excellence specialist for the city. And these students, Lily Scott, Grace Klein, Isaiah Mullins, and Maya Murphy, prepared an analysis that was summarized in this matrix. And you can just see how easy it is to capture the SDGs on one axis and the core components of the Imagine Madison Comprehensive Plan on the other. It's encouraging because we see there's a lot of progress, affinity, place where Madison is already doing the work, and yet we also see, it would make you ask, gee, what more could we be doing? How could we be filling in those blank spaces? So it's just where you want to be in terms of affirming and aspirational when you're working with city partners. And the City of Madison which is led by Mayor Satya Rhodes Conway, ranks number 5 in realization of the SDGs. And I think we all feel humble and ambitious about that, because we don't think we've done enough, but it does mean that we're positioned for leadership with mid-sized cities in the United States, and cities of that size are very important determinants of sustainable development for the nation. So it's very exciting to be in the conversation locally, and to think about what can happen as we share this experience with other cities. Here is another visualization that my students came up with, which I thought was really clear. They took the each program component, in this case neighborhoods and housing, and they crosswalked it with all of the goals and sub-goals, so that at a glance you can see which components of the SDGs are relevant and might inform your work, your planning and your implementation for your core activities. So this is a great kind of spiral visualization of crosswalking a plan component with the SDGs. Here you can see neighborhoods and housing are related to cities, they're related to poverty, they're related to education, energy, and so on. Before I say more about New York City, let me introduce SDG 360 approach number 3, which is assisting cities and local governments with self-assessment or voluntary local reporting related to the SDGs. So the voluntary local reporting is an international movement where cities voluntarily decide to report on the SDGs and how they're doing, to be transparent and accountable in relation to the SDGs, and hopefully to provide a vehicle for coordination and joint learning among cities and different levels of government. So a number of U.S. cities, including New York, and New York was first, Los Angeles, Orlando, Pittsburgh, and others are part of this global movement. And so when you're talking about student work here, you have to be careful. You can't decide that your local government is going to voluntarily locally report, and that's why I have this nuance saying, you might help with self-assessment or do a preliminary research, so that would inform a voluntary local report. If I were a mayor, I might want to know, well, what would it look like if we did decide to do it? And a class can help you test it out and see, what it would mean for you. And so gathering information as if it was a voluntary local report, and sharing that information with citizens and city leaders. Also sharing examples of what others have done in this way is a great, seeing what others have done makes it so clear for people. So that's another thing that you can do with some of the resources I'm providing here. And there are some great examples and some great resources on how to do voluntary local reports, and the link is here on this slide. And here's an example of a voluntary local review from New York City. And New York City, important leader in this movement, one of the first in the world to do a voluntary local review. This has to do with the Sustainable Development Goals not necessarily being like a binding agenda, but when you start to voluntarily report, it leads to other kinds of accountability, and it leads to other people having to report. So the idea of giving the SDGs more weight and power by doing this routine reporting for citizens was the idea. So this report provides an overview of how the city has used the SDGs as a common language to discuss local sustainable development. And they focused on 5 SDGs in New York City. Number 4, quality education. Number 8, decent work and economic growth. Number 10, reduced inequalities. Number 13, climate action. And number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. In general, when cities have done a voluntary local report or an SDG strategic effort, they have decided to focus on 3 or 4 that are priorities and looking at the way they're all interlinked. And I think that's a useful process to think of the 17 as a menu, and using them as an analytical tool we'll talk about later, but focusing on some priorities is very useful. And here you can look at this report and use it as an example for assessments that you might assist with. Here are some resources for you to help you with working for an assessment for a local community or a voluntary local review. First, we have links to the voluntary local review for Orlando, Los Angeles, Baltimore, San Jose, and Pittsburgh. There's also a link to the 2019 U.S. Cities and Sustainable Development Report put out by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and they have profiled and ranked the 100 largest cities and metropolitan areas in the U.S. And I think it's interesting to see where your city is, or where whatever one that you relate to most if you're in a smaller community. The SDSN has a lot more resources than that for applying the SDGs, and I encourage you to look there as well. There's also an ICLEI publication. That's a network of local governments for sustainability, and this is looking at 15 pathways to localize the SDGs, and that's inspiring case studies from cities around the world. And then from the United Cities and Local Government, the UCLG, they have gone into the SDGs and looked at the targets and goals and clarified what ones are most relevant for local government. So that's another great resource. There's much more than this, but I found in putting this together, if I was thinking about what would I recommend to someone to put together a module for students, it would be probably this family of resources would be a good start. So now we're getting to SDG 360 thinking strategy number 4, and this is to conduct an SDG 360 analysis using the SDG wheel to actually dig into the goals and targets of the SDGs to help cities and institutions and your local communities to plan, to implement, to monitor progress. So this approach is informed by implementation science principles and systems thinking. And the thing that I like about it is it really shows how things are connected, and it's useful to experts and generalists alike. Generalists, it helps guide them into the process-oriented thinking that will lead to insights. And for experts, it helps to scope out and to get the big picture and think about how things outside of your expertise might be affecting the work. And so the process leads you to identify co-benefits and synergies, opportunities to improve and avoid error. And then it also, and importantly, looks at identifying trade-offs honestly and explicitly so that you can really create a space for thorough and democratic deliberation and decision-making when there are trade-offs to be made. And so students can apply this approach on topics of their choosing. I've done this activity with many of my classes, and it's a great aid to designing or implementing plans, as well as improving things that are already ongoing. And I'll show you a little more about what the steps of this SDG 360 analysis look like. So there are really 9 steps to this process, and they happen in 3 phases. The first phase takes a full 360 look at the SDG goals and targets with your project in mind. The second phase then helps you use what you've learned by kind of narrowing down and digging in at the same time to get some insights about your work, about how it could be improved, where it's strong and where it's weak. And then the third thing is to figure out some action strategies, based on these insights. So first, let's talk about the steps involved in taking a full 360 look at the SDG goals and targets. The first thing that you'll do is take whatever you're working on, put it in the center of that wheel, and think about what SDG is most critical for what you're doing. And each of the SDGs has between 8 and 15 sort of sub-targets. So which of the sub-targets are the most important? Then you'll look also at what other SDGs would form a critical cluster to address this topic, and which of those sub-targets are key. At this point, you'll probably have 5 or 10 targets or indicators on a list. The third thing is to then review these targets, do a sweep of the other SDGs. Is there anything critical that you're missing? And now you have this shorter list of targets that can help you and your team do the second phase, which is to gain insights about your work. The first thing you'll do there's 3 parts to this as well. First, you'll list revealed synergies and co-benefits, and you can really use that information to design your work, to advocate, and to implement more efficiently. So that's expansive, and that is, really being positive at the outset and generating some good energy around what you're doing. There's more. This is better than we thought, right? Is the bottom line there. The second thing is to be rigorous and more critical, and to identify perhaps unintended negative consequences that the thoroughness and the systematic nature of this analysis reveal. And often you'll find things that can be easily modified so that improvement or error proofing can occur because of this analysis. And usually if it's something pretty straightforward and you handle the communication well, that is viewed as good news. Your prevention is good. And so I think that can work out pretty well, both in terms of gaining support for using SDG 360 analysis and the whatever your intervention is itself. And then the third thing is to do the hard work of and the honest work of realizing there are always trade-offs and disadvantages when we make changes. There are always equity implications. So how can we be really transparent and honest about this, and then use this information that maybe the detailed analysis revealed? We didn't realize that access to schools might be impacted when we consolidate some other aspect of development related to housing or something like that. So then, you're looking at how you can use this approach to really support fully democratic and transparent decision making, so that the compensatory actions that might be required are done, or so that disadvantages are, redesign can occur so that things are more advantageous. So this is an optimizing opportunity. And where things can't be made better, at least we're making things very explicit. From there, you have a lot of terms, common language, common ground, a lot of honesty and positivity, and maybe even some improvement work has already been done. So then you go into the third phase, which is to think about, how can you really fully respond to what you've learned from the SDG 360 analysis? What critical sectors and stakeholders need to get involved in the work together, and what kind of local knowledge and creativity and assets can be brought to bear. So the SDG 360 thinking can be the beginning of a really robust community engaged process. And I'll share some examples of work that reflects what this process can be like. Now, before I show you a series of analyses that reflect this SDG 360 thinking, I want to just go briefly over what the sub-targets look like. So for each SDG, there are, between 5 and 10 sub-targets, sub-goals, if you will, that are a little more specific. And the SDG 360 thinking is mostly working at that level. So here's an example from SDG 11. There are 10 targets, safe and affordable for sustainable cities and communities. That's the overall heading. And so safe and affordable basic services is number 1. Transportation systems is 2. You have participatory urban planning for 3. Preservation of culture and natural heritage is one of the targets, and that's a great one that turns a lot of lights on and reminds us to notice some really important things. Resilience to disaster, reduced environmental impact of the city outside. So it's not, that's I think a really important one for equity and justice concerns, and so on. And so this is the level at which we're doing analysis. And of all the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, there are 169 of these sub-targets. So by using that process that I mentioned of choosing the key SDGs and then the key targets, it's helping you to sort through that with a little bit of method and ease. You could also just go from 1 to 169, and that works too, but this is a little more intuitive and allows for some, clustered and affinity kind of thinking that's helpful. So that's what the targets are all about. Now here you have a great SDG 360 type analysis of SDG 11. And this is from the new urban agenda. I think this is probably maybe 5 years old or even more. But you see SDG 11 in the middle and how it's connecting the sub-targets of SDG 11 to the other goals. So for example, on the left, you see the no poverty, number 1, it's in red. And below, it's noting that the targets 11.1, 2, and 11.5 all relate to no poverty, upgrading slums, transport systems, reducing death and disease with a focus on the poor. This number 11 is also related to number 5, which is gender equity. And 11.2 and 11.7 are noted there as being particularly relevant. So the question is whether spaces are fully, public transport and public spaces are fully accessible to everyone. So this graphic goes around and creates connections between sub-targets of number 11 out to other SDGs, systematically with a graphic representation. And that's one way of formulating an SDG 360 wheel that gives people a way to be focused and yet, talk about the challenge very broadly. Here's another way to organize your SDG 360 wheel. And it is a little different because what it does is it is centering the topic urban health, and then it's listing all the targets under each SDG that relate to urban health. So rather than distributing sub-targets like the other graphic did, this is taking the topic and linking to all of them. So naturally, there's about 10 under SDG 3, which is health, that relate to urban health. But under 2, with food, there's one noted. Under jobs, there's one. So every SDG except for number 15 seems to have some kind of linkage. Probably a linkage could be found there too. But this is an example from an analysis that was done by Ramirez Rubio and colleagues on urban health, and it's an example of health in all policies and how the SDGs can help with implementation. And that was from a journal in 2019. Again, this could be an article that your class could read and use to think about this, second way of mapping, if you will, the SDG 360 analysis. Now here's another example of an SDG 360 kind of analysis of transportation. And I really like this one because transportation is not one of the Sustainable Development Goals, and you could argue that it could have been. And instead it shows up in a lot of places. And I think for that reason, the thinking on transportation and the interlinking is more advanced. So here they've taken the idea of transportation and placed it in the center of the wheel. On the left, we have the SDG wheel with the icons, and on the right, we have a more nuanced wheel-like analysis of transportation. And they've taken the 4 attributes of transportation: universal access, efficiency, safety, and green mobility. And they've linked it to critical SDGs. So universal access ultimately is linked to 5 targets from SDGs 5, 9, and 11. Efficiency ultimately is linked to 6 additional targets from 4 SDGs. And the green mobility is linked, again, there's just 1, but there's 5 SDGs there. So if you look at that on the outer circle there, you can see that this group has come up with some measurable sub-targets, a reasonable number that can really capture the breadth and interdisciplinarity with which, and multi-sectoriality with which you would have to address transportation. So I think this is a really great example of how you can be creative with visualizing and using graphic approaches to make something complicated more simple. And the goal is not to make it extremely simple because it is complicated. So we are going to need to, get in the weeds and get into the details to do things well. But this is, I think this is the right amount of rigor for the situation. Now, here is a more conceptual use from the Food Action Alliance of using the SDG 360 thinking. They have created the same kind of map centering food and agriculture with all of the SDGs and related icons on the outside. And then in each area, they've highlighted key issues. So they've used it really as a way to talk about issues. So, for example, when they talk about number 8 and jobs, the issue there is that agricultural growth in low-income economies can reduce poverty by half. So they're making that point that food and agriculture matters, and this is how. For number 1, for poverty, they're making the point almost 80% of poor people, live in rural areas. So they're making a comment about rurality that relates to food and agriculture. So again, a great way of using what is becoming, and hopefully will become even more so, a common language of the SDGs to highlight issues and map concepts in a way that balances the need for breadth and sort of thinking about everything with the need to focus. So really, really good and different use here. And I'm sharing this because I think, when an idea is really useful, it's sort of emergent. And you can see how this kind of 360 integrated wheel type thinking is emerging from all these different sectors. And here is an example of not just an analysis, but a stepwise tool, a bit like the one that I shared, that's looking at more of a system science sustainability tool, 10 steps toward integrating systems thinking using the SDGs. And so they're walking through, starting with the end in mind, envisioning a sustainable future, identifying priorities aligned with the SDGs, thematically, doing some mapping of systems, formulating policy, and going through was kind of like a implementation cycle. So this is a little different than the way I was conceiving of it, because the mapping tool that I was focusing on was just getting that is designed to be used in any kind of planning or implementation cycle you might already be using. So it's an add-on to what people are using, and this more integrates it into a particular cycle. But I just thought it was interesting, because this one takes it into formulating policy and then doing the mapping and scenario analyses and so forth. So again, more information can be found here at the link. But SDG 360 thinking is emerging everywhere in lots of creative ways. It does reflect the wisdom of system science and implementation science, and this very participatory approach to the to making life better with the SDGs. So in summary, SDG 360 analysis is extremely useful because it allows us to connect with all of the SDGs, to identify co-benefits and synergies, to do some error proofing and improving, and to make some explicit and transparent trade-offs when we have to, so that we have a healthy and whole discernment community for the next issue we have to face. So with that, we can turn our attention to the 5th way of using the SDGs. So the 5th way to use the SDGs in your work with local communities and local governments is to use them to help you to center equity and inclusion. And equity and inclusion is so important to me that it had to either go first or last. It's cross-cutting, and it really has to be done from the beginning and throughout. But I chose to present it last because I had multiple tools, and it builds on some of the things from earlier that made more sense here. But I think the SDGs offer us some great guidance on equity and inclusion. And SDG 10, which is about inequality overall, and SDG 5, which relates to gender equality. But I do think some additional tools are needed for the kind of work we want to be doing in the US context. And so I'm sharing some other things that I have found to be very useful related to racial equity, related to indigeneity, related to gender, related to human rights. I have a framework called the Heads Up model that I'll share. So there's a bunch of readings. They're mostly short, and it's mostly, this is about good questions. And it can sound like, talking about this is enough, but it's not just talking about it, but the kind of talking that leads to action is when people can do really deep perspective taking, and really think about what is someone else's lived experience like? What kind of truth telling can we do? How can we do that sort of iteratively to dig deeper and build relationships around it? So I think these frameworks are very useful. And when you have students ask questions together, and they are receiving the world as it is, and they are more able to question the world we've given them and challenge us about it and not be defensive about it. And so I think involving, having a multi-generational approach to this work, I think I learned from my students in all aspects, but I probably learned the most in this aspect because they are more fearless, and their whole lives are in front of them, and they want to create something more. So I'm going to walk through some tools. Again, these are resources with links that are ready to use, and I think students can do some very useful reflecting and reports, and maybe even recommendations for action if they center equity inclusion in their work. So as I mentioned, SDG 10 begins to give us some guidance about reducing inequalities, and we go again to the target level. That's where you start getting some specificity and some prompting of things you might look for. So income inequality, political inclusion, they're both different. They're both important. Ending discrimination. Some of these are more related to the international relations and less for the city level, but you can kind of crosswalk through that together. So SDG 10 is a great place to start for thinking about reducing inequalities in specific ways that matter. SDG 5 is another resource for centering inclusion and equity. In spite of the fact that SDG 10 was there with its focus on inequalities, it was felt that gender equality was challenging enough that it also needed its own SDG. And so things like discrimination, violence, access to health care, elimination of forced marriage, thinking about child care and unpaid care and what that means in the family and in society. There are 9 targets here: full participation in leadership and decision making, and politics and representation, all of those. There's also one on technology, which I think is interesting and important, because it's not only hoping that women will have equal access to learning about developing expertise in that area, but also that will make sure that the big data that governs our lives more and more doesn't have inheritance biases related to gender or race or other kinds of historical marginalization that can do further harm. So there's a lot of work here to be done, and I would say that the SDG 5 is a beginning rather than an endpoint. As I mentioned, it doesn't include all topics, but there is global consensus here. There are some great measures, and it's very unlikely that you are living in a community that does not need to do some work on centering gender equality and all the intersectionalities that can make it even more challenging for, say, women of color, women when living with disabilities, people with non-binary gender identities who deserve to be, have their dignity and full humanity reflected in how we live as a society. In addition to using SDGs 5 and 10 to center equity and social inclusion, I'd like to share some critical questions for racial equity that have been developed by Sonia Balaji of the Arbodi Project. And here I provided a link to learn more about Sonia and her scholarship and her work and her team. She shares some do's and don'ts that I think are very useful. The do's point us to ways that we can move towards equity, and the don'ts help us to see ways in which our own actions might be perpetuating racial inequity. And I'm going to start with the don'ts. Let's try not to introduce problems in the present without referring to why the problem exists and how different entities are connected to the making of that problem. Let's look at the history and why we are where we are when we're facing challenges. The other thing we should avoid is offering a singular view of what success looks like or what progress looks like. Leave room for multiple visions and multiple positive futures. And the third thing to avoid, a don't, is don't offer simplistic analyses and answers that fail to invite people to engage with the complexity or think more deeply. Now, toward the do's. Some of the do's would be inviting people to analyze things from different perspectives. There's always that power to perspective taking. Reflecting and encouraging reflection in others about how we are complicit in the making of the problems that we're trying to address. Also acknowledging that there are multiple logical ways of looking at the same issue, and that the issue might mean something different based on our different lived experiences. Making sure that we include an analysis of power is another important to do. And also ensuring that when we're working together, we think about the experience people are having when they're doing the work, and that we include a mix of structural and relational and healing strategies that follow the cultural norms or worldviews of the community being served. So that means, doing things in a different key that is, local and familiar and home and indigenous to the community that you're working in. And then finally, Sonia points out how important it is to remember that community members who are affected by inequity are entitled and have the right to disagree and differ legitimately with systems, even if those systems are working to help them. So to remember, just remember about the dignity and equality, and that we really are all equal as citizens. And when we're making decisions together, we need to have that in mind. The critical questions for racial equity that I just presented were based on, or derived from, I should say, this heads-up model, which is a framework for thinking about critical literacy, and is organized around some core concepts, and then looking at, recommended practices and practices to avoid, sort of don'ts and do's again. And so students can study this as on background for this work. They might use this framework directly with communities, or they might use the simpler language of the critical questions for racial equity. But notions of hegemony, ethnocentrism, ahistoricism, depoliticization, salvationism, the sneaky problem of uncomplicated solutions, and paternalism are all things that students can study and think about what it means to identify and work through these challenges so that authentic change can be realized and authentic civic discourse can occur. And so I offer this here because I have used this in combination with the critical questions so that students study this and they have these ideas in their toolkit. They've really thought about them, and then they go to the community with a less academic set of questions that accomplishes the same kind of insights. Here's another set of critical questions, and this was developed by myself and some colleagues at UW-Madison, looking at sustainability with a loving and critical lens. In other words, we all want to do sustainability work, and we all found some shortcomings to the way it was done, and we thought that being more intentional about the human rights aspects, being more intentional about gender equity aspects, and being more intentional about the ways that local and indigenous knowledges were attended to and included in the work would all be able to make it better. So this article has some international case studies. If you're doing international work, I think you'd find that very interesting. But these critical questions could be useful anywhere. So there's a kind of a set of things to think about related to each of these topic areas, and I wanted to share that in case it's useful for the topics that you're working on. The tools that I've presented so far, the equity-oriented SDGs, the heads-up model, the critical questions, and the 3D analysis are all ways to help you reflect more carefully about experiences that you're having, to think critically. This tool is a little different. It's about dialogue and better dialogue. And I think when you see this let's talk, right, that's very different than what you'll often see at this point in a talk where there'll be the word questions with a question mark, or comments, questions. But I think these prompts help people to think about all the ways they can have a dialogue about a topic, share what they know in relation to it, and get people talking. So, sometimes when I have students who feel shy about talking, I'll just say, just agree with something. You just break the sound barrier and mention something you agree with. But here you have a bunch of prompts that you can use with, or encourage people to use, so that the conversations that happen in the context of these, spaces, whether they're community meetings or your own classroom, can be more dialogic. So, what I think I heard you say, or I'm surprised to learn that, or, I agree about this, or could you show me that? That's very different than saying, do you have a question? And I think when we think about what it means to make change, we're all teachers and we're all learners and we're all beginning and we're all experts. And these kinds of ways of promoting dialogue allows everyone to play all those roles. So think very carefully about how you structure dialogue and what prompts you use. And I think I've given this tool to students, and some have commented that they've used it in other classes as well, when they know they should say something, when they want to think of something useful to say. So encouraging dialogue that is a little more, a little less rigid than Q&A, a little more multifaceted, bringing in lived experience, it really aligns with all that we're saying about equity and inclusion. And again, dialogue, really authentic dialogue that increases trust and builds relationships, does lead to action. So this is why, I get very excited about making sure that critical conversations and deep sharing takes place between students, among students, and with communities. So in summary, SDG 360 thinking is a really powerful way to engage with communities from your place as a university, with your students in your research, and so on. And there are 5 great ways to do it. One is to tell stories that are local and place-based in order to establish relevance, urgency, and consensus related to the Sustainable Development Goals. The second is to crosswalk the SDGs with city plans to acknowledge what is already being done and then build on that foundation to expand efforts and explore new directions. The third is to assist with self-assessment and voluntary local reporting to determine priorities and foster transparency and accountability, to encourage periodic voluntary local reporting in the communities where you work. Fourth, you can do SDG 360 analysis to highlight co-benefits and maximization strategies. to error-proof and improve current plans, and to identify trade-offs that need to be resolved with a democratic participatory process. Fifth, you can center equity inclusion to improve well-being for all and include the perspectives and leadership of those who've been marginalized and those who've experienced systemic injustice. Most likely, you'll start out with number one, and you should not feel that you need to do all 5 ways. Even just telling stories and connecting people to the realities of sustainable development can make a big difference. But as you go on in your work and as your students go on, this menu of 5 ways seems to give us a nice broad range of strategies to engage with communities. And I hope that you'll try some of them and share some of your strategies as well in various learning communities so that we can all get better at using the SDGs to make change around the world and at home in our local communities.
Thank you for listening. If you would like to share your experiences with SDG 360 thinking, you can share them with Lori DiPrete Brown at dipretebrown@wisc.edu, or you can share it with the EPIC Network at info@epicn.org. This resource will be available on the EPICN site along with quite a few other resources that will be useful to you in your community engagement work. Thank you to Lori DiPrete Brown for creating this presentation. If you are interested in learning more about SDG 360 thinking and the EPIC model, you can sign up for the EPICN member commons at commons.epicn.org.